Hello, and welcome back to Read Aloud. Today on Read Aloud with Dan, with me, is Friedrich Engels's Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, or perhaps better said, Scientific Socialism and Utopian Socialism. These are two different kinds. And we're reading from Chapter 3 on Historical Materialism. Chapter 3 Historical Materialism. Engels says, the materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life, and next to production, the exchange of things produced, is the basis of all social structure. That in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are to be sought not in the philosophy, but in the economics of each particular epoch. The growing perception that existing social institutions are unreasonable and unjust, that reason has become unreason and right wrong, is only proof that in the modes of production and exchange, changes have silently taken place with which the social order, adapted to earlier economic conditions, is no longer in keeping. From this, it also follows that the means of getting rid of the incongruities that have been brought to light must also be present in a more or less developed condition within the changed modes of production themselves. These means are not to be invented by deduction from fundamental principles, but are to be discovered in the stubborn facts of the existing system of production. What is, then, the position of modern socialism in this connection? The present situation of society, and again he's writing this in 1880, this is now pretty generally conceded, is the creation of the ruling class of today, of the bourgeoisie. And that's still the ruling class of today, of 2025. Engels says the mode of production peculiar to the bourgeoisie, known since Marx as the capitalist mode of production, was incompatible with the feudal system, with the privileges it conferred upon individuals, entire social ranks, and local corporations, as well as with the hereditary ties of subordination which constituted the framework of its social organization. The bourgeoisie broke up the feudal system and built upon its ruins the capitalist order of society, the kingdom of free competition, of personal liberty, of the equality before the law of all commodity owners, of all the rest of the capitalist blessings. From there onward, from there forward, rather, the capitalist mode of production could develop in freedom, since Steam, machinery, and the making of machines by machinery transformed the older manufacture into modern industry. The productive forces evolved under the guidance of the bourgeoisie, developed with a rapidity and in a degree unheard of before. But just as the older manufacture in its time and handicraft, becoming more developed under its influence, had come into collision with the feudal trammels of the guilds, so now modern industry, in its complete development, comes into collision with the bounds within which the capitalist mode of production holds it confined. The new productive forces have already outgrown the capitalist mode of using them, and this conflict between the productive forces and modes of production is not a conflict engendered in the mind of man, like that between original sin and divine justice. It exists, in fact, objectively outside us, independently of the will and actions, even of the men that have brought it on. Modern socialism is nothing but the reflex in thought of this conflict in fact, its ideal reflection in the minds first of the class directly suffering under it, the working class. He says this contradiction it exists. It's real. It exists outside of us, and it's up to the development of the modes of production and the productive forces that will force this contradiction to the surface, so to speak. And what we call socialism is just a bunch of ideas that we talk about, uh, you know, regarding this conflict. It's us reflecting on this whole thing that's happening. Engels says, now, what does this conflict consist of? Before capitalist production, uh, id est, or that is, in the Middle Ages, the system of petty industry obtained generally, based upon the private property of the laborers in their means of production. So, petty industry, just small businesses, not this whole gigantified industrial production of commodities that we know of today. Just people vibing and making things, mostly for themselves, but also sometimes they make some leftover that they can sell. He says, in the country, the agriculture of the small peasant, free man or serf. In the towns, the handicrafts organized in guilds. The instruments of labor, land, agricultural implements, the workshop, the tool, were the instruments of labor of single individuals, adapted for the use of one worker, and therefore, of necessity, small, dwarfish, circumscribed, he said. Circumscribed, he says. But for this very reason, they belonged as a rule to the producer himself. To concentrate these scattered, limited means of production, to enlarge them, to turn them into the powerful levers of production of the present day. This was precisely the historic role of capitalist production and of its upholder, the bourgeoisie. In the fourth section of Capital, Marx had explained in detail how since the 15th century this has been categorically worked out through the three phases of simple cooperation, manufacture, and modern industry. But the bourgeoisie, as is shown there, could not transform these puny means of production into mighty productive forces without transforming them at the same time from means of production of the individual into social means of production, only workable by a collectivity of men. The spinning wheel, the hand loom, the blacksmith's hammer were replaced by the spinning machine, the power loom, the steam hammer. The individual workshop by the factory, implying the cooperation of hundreds and thousands of workmen. In like manner, production itself changed from a series of individual into a series of social acts, and the production from individual to social products. The yarn, the cloth, the metal articles that now come out of the factory were the joint product of many workers, through whose hands they had successfully to pass before they were ready. No one person could say of them, I made that, this is my product. But where, in a given society, the fundamental form of production is that spontaneous division of labor which creeps in gradually and not upon any preconceived plan, there the products take on the form of commodities, whose mutual exchange, buying and selling, enable the individual producers to satisfy their manifold wants. And this was the case in the Middle Ages. The peasant, for instance, sold to the artisan agricultural products and bought from him the products of handicraft. Into this society of individual producers, of commodity producers, the new mode of production thrust itself. In the midst of the old division of labor, grown up spontaneously and upon no definite plan, which had governed the whole of society, now arose division of labor upon a definite plan, as organized in the factory. Side by side with individual production appeared social production. So it's not like they invented the factory and then individual production was abolished. We still have it to this day. But it's clear that social production is the dominant form of production of commodities and of society. He says the products of both were sold in the same market. Yeah, that is the issue here, right? You're starting to notice it. And therefore, at prices at least approximately equal. But organization upon a definite plan was stronger than spontaneous division of labor. The factories, working with the combined social forces of a collectivity of individuals, produced their commodities far more cheaply than the individual small producers. Individual producers succumbed in one department after another. Socialized production revolutionized all the old methods of production. But its revolutionary character was, at the same time, so little recognized that it was, on the contrary, introduced as a means of increasing and developing the production of commodities. When it arose, it found ready-made and made liberal use of certain machinery for the production and exchange of commodities. It was a matter of course that under it the old forms of appropriation remained in full swing and were applied to its products as well. In the medieval stage of evolution of the production of commodities, the question as to the owner of the product of labor could not arise. The individual producer, as a rule, had from raw material belonging to himself, and generally his own handicraft, produced it with his own tools, by the labor of his own hands or of his family. There was no need for him to appropriate the new product. It belonged wholly to him. I'm sorry, I got lost. It belonged wholly to him as a matter of course. His property in the product was, therefore, based upon his own labor. Even where external help was used, this was, as a rule, of little importance and very generally was compensated by something other than wages. The apprentices and journeymen of the guilds worked less for board and wages than for education, in order that they might become master craftsmen themselves. Then came the concentration of the means of production and of the producers in large workshops and manufactories, their transformation into actual socialized means of production and socialized producers. But the socialized producers and means of production and their products were still treated after this change just as they had been before, that is, as the means of production and the products of individuals. Hitherto, the owner of the instruments of labor had himself appropriated the product because, as a rule, it was his own product and the assistance of others was the exception. Now, the owner of the instruments of labor always appropriated to himself the product, although it was no longer his product, but exclusively the product of the labor of others. Thus, the products now produced socially were not appropriated by those who had actually set in motion the means of production and actually produced the economies, but by the capitalists. The means of production and production itself had become in essence socialized, but they were subjected to a form of appropriation which presupposes the private production of individuals, under which, therefore, everyone owns his own product and brings it to market. The mode of production is subjected to this form of appropriation, although it abolishes the conditions upon which the latter rests. This contradiction, which gives to the new mode of production its capitalistic character, contains the germ of the whole of the social antagonisms of today. That was relevant in 1880 and it's still relevant today in 2025. I cannot make this point enough. This is the whole fucking thing. This is it. That's the germ of the whole of oh my God, this is poetry. How we did not read this in high school just blows my mind, you know? Like, what? They didn't want us to know how this whole thing worked? Why? That is so fucking weird, man. Bugs me. We were so undereducated and miseducated, it drives me nuts, man. Starting to think that schools in the West are just a psyop to convince the rest of the world that we have education, when we don't really. They didn't want us to know. Reading on, Engels says, the greater the mastery obtained by the new mode of production over all important fields of production and in all manufacturing countries, the more it reduced individual production to an insignificant residuum. That's a $10 word right there. The more clearly was brought out the incompatibility of socialized production with capitalistic appropriation. So the whole thing, again, he says it presupposes private production of individuals. It presupposes this whole thing where we all did this thing, where we made stuff and then we brought it to market because we made it. It presupposes it, but at the same time, it abolishes it. God, it makes you so fucking furious, does it not? He says the first capitalists found, as we have said, alongside other forms of labor, wage labor ready-made for them on the market. But it was exceptional, complementary, accessory, transitory wage labor. The agricultural laborer, though, upon occasion he hired himself out by the day, had a few acres of his own land on which he could at all events live at a pinch. The guilds were so organized that the journeyman of today became master of tomorrow. But all this changed as soon as the means of production became socialized and concentrated in the hands of capitalists. I like to think of this period as like peak humanity in some ways. Of course, I'm not including, settler colonialism in that whole mess of things. But there was some good stuff happening there for a while. There was some okay stuff happening before Europe started Europing, before the West started Westing. Anyways, he says the agriculture. Let's read on here. It says all this changed. All this changed as soon as the means of production became socialized and concentrated in the hands of capitalists. That's when it all got fucked. This is what Engels is saying. This is when it all went to shit. Not that everything was perfect, but this is when the shit hit the fan. He says the means of production, as well as the product of the individual producer, became more and more worthless. Sounds bad, doesn't it? There was nothing left for him but to turn wage worker under the capitalist. Wage labor, aforetime the exception and accessory, now became the rule and basis of all production. Aforetime complementary, it now became the sole remaining function of the worker. The wage worker for a time became a wage worker for life. The number of these permanent was further enormously increased by the breaking up of the feudal system that occurred at the same time, by the disbanding of the retainers of the feudal lords, the eviction of the peasants from their homesteads, etc. Separation was made complete between the means of production concentrated in the hands of the capitalists on the one side, and the producers possessing nothing but their labor power on the other. The contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation manifested itself as the antagonism of proletariat and bourgeoisie. Makes me think actually of how when the capitalists need a bigger pool of labor, they do neoliberalisms all over the world, which creates conditions under which people want to escape those conditions. So that creates refugees, and then those refugees come here, and that creates a bigger pool of wage labor, wage slaves, doesn't it? So he says, we've seen that the capitalist mode of production thrust its way into a society of commodity producers, of individual producers, whose social bond was the exchange of their products. But every society based upon the production of commodities has this peculiarity, that the producers have lost control over their own social interrelations. Each man produces for himself with such means of production as he may happen to have, and for such exchange as he may require to satisfy his remaining wants. No one knows how much of this particular article is coming on the market, nor how much of it will be wanted. No one knows whether his individual product will meet an actual demand, whether he will be able to make good his costs of production, or even to sell his commodity at all. Anarchy reigns in socialized production. Hey, wait. That's what they call us, pejoratively. Call us anarchists. But they're creating this socialized production thing, and it's really it's anarchy in a way. There's really no plans here. He says, but the production of commodities, like every other form of production, has its peculiar inherent laws inseparable from it. And these laws work despite anarchy, in and through anarchy. Catch that? They reveal themselves in the only persistent form of social interrelations, that is, in exchange. And here they affect the individual producers as compulsory laws of competition. I don't know, I said it like that, competition. They are, at first, unknown to these producers themselves, and have to be discovered by them gradually and as the result of experience. They work themselves out, therefore, independently of the producers, and in antagonism to them, as inexorable natural laws of their particular form of production. The product governs the producers. In medieval society, especially in the earlier centuries, production was essentially directed towards satisfying the wants of the individual. It satisfied, in the main, only the wants of the producer and his family. Where relations of personal dependence existed, as in the country, it also helped to satisfy the wants of the feudal lord. In all this there was, therefore, no exchange. The products, consequently, did not assume the character of commodities. The family of the peasant produced almost everything they wanted, clothes and furniture, as well as the means of subsistence. Only when it began to produce more than was sufficient to supply its own wants and the payments in kind to the feudal lords, only then did it also produce commodities. Commodities, something made to be sold. Effectively, basically. This surplus, thrown into socialized exchange and offered for sale, became commodities. The artisan in the towns, it is true, had from the first to produce for exchange. But they also themselves supplied the greatest part of their individual wants. They had gardens and plots of land. They turned their cattle out into the communal forest, which also yielded them timber and firing. The women spun flax, wool, and so forth. Production for the purpose of exchange, production of commodities, was only in its infancy. Hence, exchange was restricted, the market narrow, the methods of production stable. There was local exclusiveness without, local unity within. The mark in the country, in the town, the guild. But with the extension of the production of commodities, and especially with the introduction of the capitalist mode of production, the laws of commodity production, hitherto latent, came into action more openly and with greater force. The old bonds were loosened, the old exclusive limits broken through. The producers were more and more turned into independent, isolated producers of commodities. It became apparent that the production of society at large was ruled by absence of plan, by accident, by anarchy. And this anarchy grew to greater and greater heights. But the chief means by aid of which the capitalist mode of production intensified this anarchy of socialized production was the exact opposite of anarchy. It was the increasing organization of production upon a social basis in every individual productive establishment. By this, the old peaceful, it's the white man's word, stable condition of things was ended. Wherever this organization of production was introduced into a branch of industry, it allowed no other method of production by its side. The field of labor became a battleground. The great geographical discoveries and the colonization following them multiplied markets and quickened the transformation of handicraft into manufacture. The war did not simply break out between the individual producers of particular localities. Local struggles begat, in their turn, national conflicts, the commercial wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. Finally, modern industry and the opening of the world market made the struggle universal, and at the same time gave it an unheard of virulence. Advantages in natural or artificial conditions of production now decide the existence or non-existence of individual capitalists, as well as of whole industries and countries. He that falls is remorselessly cast aside. It is the Darwinian struggle of the individual for existence transferred from nature to society with intensified violence. The conditions of existence natural to the animal appear as the final term of human development. The contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation now presents itself as an antagonism between the organization of production in the individual workshop and the anarchy of production in society generally. Capitalist mode of production moves in these two forms of the antagonism immanent to it from its very origin. It is never able to get out of that vicious circle which Fourier had already discovered. What Fourier could not indeed see in his time is that this circle is gradually narrowing, that the movement becomes more and more a spiral, and must come to an end, like the movement of planets by collision with the center. It is the compelling force of anarchy in the production of society at large that more and more completely turns the great majority of men into proletarians, and it is the masses of the proletariat again who will finally put an end to anarchy in production. It is the compelling force of anarchy in social production that turns the limitless perfectibility of machinery under modern industry into a compulsory law by which every individual industrial capitalist must perfect his machinery more and more under penalty of ruin. But the perfecting of machinery is making human labor superfluous. If the introduction and increase of machinery means the displacement of millions of manual workers by a few machine workers, improvement in machinery means the displacement of more and more of the machine workers themselves. It means, in the last instance, the production of a number of available workers in excess of the average needs of capital, the formation of a complete industrial reserve army, as I called it in 1845. In the conditions of the working class in England. He says here, the law that always equilibrates the relative surplus population or industrial reserve army to the extent and energy of accumulation, this law rivets the laborer to capital more firmly than the wedges of Vulcan did Prometheus to the rock. It establishes an accumulation of misery corresponding with the accumulation of capital. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole. That is, on the side of the class that produces its own product in the form of capital. Engels says, and to expect any other division of the products from the capitalist mode of production is the same as expecting the electrodes of a battery not to decompose acidulated water, not to liberate oxygen at the positive, hydrogen at the negative pole, so long as they are connected with the battery. In other words, Engels here is saying that if you expect anything other than this increasing if you expect anything other than this increasingly accumulating wealth in the hands of one class, you don't know the science of how human society develops. He says here, we have seen that the ever increasing perfection of modern machinery is, by the anarchy of social production, turned into a compulsory law that forces the individual industrial capitalist always to improve his machinery, always to increase its productive force. The bare possibility of extending the field of production is transformed for him into a similarly compulsory law. The enormous expansive force of modern industry, compared with that of gases, is mere child's play. Appears to us now as a necessity for expansion, both qualitative and quantitative, that laughs at all resistance. Such resistance is offered by consumption, by sales, by the markets for the for the products of modern industry. But the capacity for extension, extensive and intensive, of the markets is primarily governed by quite different laws that work much less energetically. The extension of the markets cannot keep pace with the extension of production. The collision becomes inevitable, and as this cannot produce any real solution so long as it does not break in pieces the capitalist mode of production, the collisions become periodic. Capitalist production has begotten another vicious circle. As a matter of fact, since 1825, when the first general crisis broke out, the whole industrial and commercial world, production and exchange among all civilized people and their more or less barbaric hangers-on, are thrown out of joint about once every 10 years. I think we got it down to 7 years, didn't we? He says commerce is at a standstill. The markets are glutted. Products accumulate as multitudinous as they are unsaleable. Hard cash disappears. Credit vanishes. Factories are closed. The mass of the workers are in want of the means of subsistence because they have produced too much of the means of subsistence. Bankruptcy follows upon bankruptcy, execution upon execution. The stagnation lasts for years. Productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale until the accumulated mass of commodities finally filter off, more or less depreciated in value, until production and exchange gradually begin to move again. Little by little, the pace quickens. It becomes a trot. The industrial trot breaks into a canter. The canter, in turn, grows into a headlong gallop of a perfect steeplechase of industry, commercial credit, and speculation, which finally, after breakneck leaps, ends where it began, in the ditch of a crisis. And so over and over again. We have now, since the year 1825, gone through this 5 times. And at the present moment, 1877, we are going through it for the 6th time. And the character of these crises is so clearly defined that Fourier hit all of them off when he described the first crise pléthorique, or a crisis from plethora, or abundance. In these crises, the contradiction between socialized production and capitalist appropriation ends in a violent explosion. The circulation of commodities is, for the time being, stopped. Money, the means of circulation, becomes a hindrance to circulation. All the laws of production and circulation of commodities are turned upside down. The economic collision has reached its apogee. The mode of production is in rebellion against the mode of exchange. How many times has this happened in your life? You know, I've just turned 41. This has happened like 6 times in my life. Is that right? I have to go back and count them. Engels says, the fact that the socialized organization of production within the factory has developed so far that it has become incompatible with the anarchy of production in society, which exists side by side with and dominates it, is brought home to the capitalists themselves by the violent concentration of capital that occurs during crises, through the ruin of many large and a still greater number of small capitalists. The whole mechanism of the capitalist mode of production breaks down under the pressure of the productive forces, its own creations. It is no longer able to turn all this mass of means of production into capital. They lie fallow, and for that very reason, the Industrial Reserve Army must also lie fallow. Because we're also commodities to them. Our labor power is, at least. He says, means of production, means of subsistence, available laborers, all the elements of production and of general wealth are present in abundance. Abundance. Sort of a piece of discourse happening right now, actually. Proving again how relevant Engels is. A million years later? 145 years later, you guys. 145. All right, where was I? He says, but abundance becomes the source of distress and want, quote unquote. That's from Fourier. He says, because it is the very thing that prevents the transformation of the means of production and subsistence into capital. For, in capitalistic society, the means of production can only function when they have undergone a preliminary transformation into capital, into the means of exploiting human labor power. The necessity of this transformation into capital of the means of production and subsistence stands like a ghost between these and the workers. It alone prevents the coming together of the material and personal levers of production. It alone forbids the means of production to function, the workers to work and live. On the one hand, therefore, the capitalist mode of production stands convicted of its own incapacity to further direct these productive forces. On the other hand, these productive forces themselves, with increasing energy, press forward to the removal of the existing contradiction, to the abolition of their quality as capital, to the practical recognition of their character as social production forces. He's saying that the machines and productive forces of society have a private aspect of ownership because they're effectively commodities. Within this private ownership of the means of production hides its practical social character as social productive forces, which, through the increasingly rapid development of these productive forces, press forward to that practical recognition. These things are begging to be recognized as social forces of production. He says, this rebellion of the productive forces as they grow more and more powerful against their equality as capital, this stronger and stronger command that their social character shall be recognized, forces the capitalist class, the capital class itself, to treat them more and more as social productive forces, so far as this is possible under capitalist conditions. The period of industrial high pressure, with its unbounded inflation of credit, not less than the crash itself, by the collapse of great capitalist establishments, tends to bring about that form of the socialization of great masses of the means of production which we meet with in the different kinds of joint stock companies. Many of these means of production and of distribution are, from the outset, so colossal that, like the railways, they exclude all other forms of capitalist expansion. At a further stage of evolution, this form also becomes insufficient. The producers on a large scale in a particular branch of an industry in a particular country unite in a trust, a union for the purpose of regulating production. They determine the total amount to be produced, parcel it out among themselves, and thus enforce the selling price fixed beforehand. But trusts of this kind, as soon as business becomes bad, are generally liable to break up, and on this very account compel a yet greater concentration of association. The whole of a particular industry is turned into one gigantic joint stock company. Internal competition gives place to the internal monopoly of this one company. This has happened in 1890 with the English alkali production, which is now, after the fusion of 48 large works in the hands of one company, conducted upon a single plan and with a capital of £6 million, which I'm sure was a lot. In the trusts, freedom of competition changes into its very opposite, into monopoly. And the production without any definite plan of capitalistic society capitulates to the production upon a definite plan of the invading socialistic society. Certainly, this is so far still to the benefit and advantage of the capitalists. But in this case, the exploitation is so palpable that it must break down. No nation will put up with production conducted by trusts, with so barefaced an exploitation of the community by a small band of dividend mongers. Yeah. That's why the United States is more like a prison house of nations, isn't it? He says this necessity. Oh, I got lost. He says, in any case, with trusts or without, the official representative of capitalist society, the state, will ultimately have to undertake the direction of production. And here's his 14th annotation. He says, I say have to, for only when the means of production and distribution have actually outgrown the form of management by joint stock companies, and when, therefore, the taking them over by the state has become economically inevitable, only then, even as if it is the state of today that affects this, is there an economic advance, the attainment of another step preliminary to the taking over of all productive forces by society itself. But of late, he says, Since Bismarck went in for state ownership of industrial establishments, a kind of spurious socialism has arisen, degenerating now and again into something of flunkyism that, without more ado, declares all state ownership, even of Bismarckian, even of the Bismarckian sort, to be socialistic. Certainly, if the taking over by the state of the tobacco industry is socialistic, then Napoleon and Metternich must be numbered upon the founders of socialism. Come on, man. That's funny. He says, if the Belgian state, for quite ordinary political and financial reasons, itself constructed its chief railway lines, if Bismarck, not under any economic compulsion, took over for the state the chief Prussian lines, simply to be better able to have them in the hand in case of war, to bring up the railway employees as voting cattle for the government, and especially to create for himself a new source of income independently of parliamentary votes. This was in no sense a socialistic measure, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously. Otherwise, the Royal Maritime Company, the Royal Porcelain Manufacture, and even the regimental tailor of the army would also be socialistic institutions, or even, as was seriously proposed by a sly dog in Friedrich William III's reign, the taking over by the state of the brothels. Oh, man. So this is obviously relevant still to this day. We're talking about now how Trump is, and his administration is has got like a 10% stake in Intel, chip manufacturer. And there's some people in 2025 who are socialists or even call themselves communists who are like clapping like seals. They're like, yeah, more of this. You fucking idiot. What are you doing? Grow up. Jesus Christ. So he says, Engels goes on and says, this necessity for conversion into state property is felt first in the great institutions for intercourse, wink, and communication. The post office, the telegraphs, the railways. If the crises demonstrate the incapacity for the bourgeoisie for managing any longer modern productive forces, the transformation of the great establishments for production and distribution into joint stock companies, trusts, and state property show how unnecessary the bourgeoisie are for that purpose. All the social functions of the capitalist has no further social function than that of pocketing dividends, tearing off coupons, and gambling on the stock exchange, where the different capitalists despoil one another of their capital. At first, the capitalist mode of production forces out the workers. Now it forces out the capitalists and reduces them, just as it reduced the workers, to the ranks of the surplus population, although not immediately into those of the industrial reserve army. But the transformation either into joint stock, I'm thinking, he says, although not immediately into those of the industrial reserve army. I'm thinking about these tech bros that get these $1 billion valuations, and then a year or two later they got nothing, and then these guys, what do? Do they have to get a job at Burger King right away? No, they live off their they probably got loans, you know what I mean? They live off their loans until they get another uh, get into another VC, So he says, but the transformation, either into joint stock companies and trusts or into state ownership, does not do away with the capitalist nature of the productive forces. In the joint stock companies and trusts, this is obvious. And the modern state, again, is only the organization that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against the encroachments as well of the workers as of the individual capitalists. So he says here we have a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. He says the modern state, no matter what is its form, is essentially a capitalist machine. The state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more it actually becomes the national capitalist, the more citizens it exploits. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with. It is rather brought to a head. But brought to a head, it topples over. State ownership of the productive forces is not the solution of the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the element of that solution. This solution can only consist in the practical recognition of the social nature of the modern forces of production, and therefore in harmonizing with the socialized character of the means of production. That's the solution. He says, and this can only come about by society openly and directly taking possession of the productive forces which have outgrown all control, except that of society as a whole. The social character of the means of production and of the products today reacts against the producers, periodically disrupting all production and exchange, acts only like a law of nature working blindly, forcibly, destructively. But with the taking over by society of the productive forces, the social character of the means of production and the products will be utilized by the producers with a perfect understanding of its nature. And instead of being a source of disturbance and periodical collapse, will become the most powerful lever of production itself. I mean, come on, just look at what the Soviet Union did. They went from a backwards ass country to an extremely productive one, and they didn't do so on the basis of exploitation. That's why they were able to raise their living conditions dramatically. The masses went from having nothing to having something. Do you understand how big of a deal that is? And the scale on which they did that in the Soviet Union, and the scale on which they're doing it in China right now, it's just unheard of. Just amazing stuff. Engels says active social forces work exactly like natural forces, blindly, forcibly, destructively, so long as we do not understand and reckon with them. That's why we got to spread that revolutionary consciousness. He says, but when once we understand them, when once we grasp their action, their direction, their effects, it depends only upon ourselves to subject them more and more to our own will, and by means of them, to reach our own ends. And this holds quite especially of the mighty productive forces of today. As long as we obstinately refuse to understand the nature and character of these social means of action, and this understanding goes against the grain of the capitalist mode of production and its defenders, so long as these forces are at work in spite of us, in opposition to us, so long as they master us, as we have shown above in detail. But when once their nature is understood, they can, in the hands of producers working together, be transformed from master demons into willing servants. The difference is that between the destructive force of electricity in the lightning in the storm and the electricity under command in the telegraph and the voltaic arc, the difference between a conflagration and fire working in the service of man. With this recognition, at last, of the real nature of the productive forces of today, the social anarchy of production gives place to a social regulation of production upon a definite plan, according to the needs of the community and of each individual. Sounds good. Then the capitalist mode of appropriation, in which the product enslaves first the producer and then the appropriator, is replaced by the mode of appropriation of the products that is based upon the nature of the modern means of production. Upon the one hand, direct social appropriation as the means to the maintenance and extension of production. On the other, direct individual appropriation as means of subsistence and of enjoyment. Whilst the capitalist mode of production more and more completely transforms the great majority of the population into proletarians, it creates the power which, under penalty of its own destruction, is forced to accomplish this revolution. Whilst it forces on more and more of the transformation of the vast means of production already socialized into state property, it shows itself the way to accomplishing this revolution. The proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property. But in doing this, it abolishes itself as proletariat, abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, and also abolishes the state as state. Society, thus far, based upon class antagonisms, had need of the state. Generally speaking, the state is a tool of the owning class of a society. He says, that is, of an organization of the particular class which was pro tempore, the exploiting class, an organization for the purpose of preventing any interference from without with the existing conditions of production, and therefore, especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited classes in the condition of oppression corresponding with the given mode of production, that being of slavery or serfdom or wage labor, or as I like to call it, wage slavery. It is indeed a form of slavery. Engels says, the state was the official representative of society as a whole, the gathering of it together into a visible embodiment. But it was this only insofar as it was the state of that class which itself represented for the time being society as a whole. In ancient times, the state of slave-owning citizens. In Middle Ages, the feudal lords. In our own times, the bourgeoisie. All my homies hate the bourgeoisie, you know? When, at last, it becomes the real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based upon our present anarchy in production, with the collisions and excesses arising from these, are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed, and a special repressive force, a state, is no longer necessary. The first act by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of the whole of society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. This is, at the same time, its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes in one domain after another superfluous, and then dies out of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase, a free state, both as to its justifiable use at times by agitators, and as to its ultimate scientific insufficiency, and also of the demands of the so-called anarchists for the abolition of the state out of hand. Yeah. So he says, hey, anarchists, you're idealists. You're not materialists. When it comes to getting rid of the state, you have an idealistic way of looking at it. You think you could just abolish it. You think you could just hit the abolish the state button. You think that we could just hit the abolish classes button. But guess what? You've never found that button yourselves. If you had, wouldn't you have pushed it by now? It's like these anarchists sometimes act like they have the abolish the state button and they have the abolish classes button, but they're just hiding it behind their backs, taunting us. Push the button if you have it, dipshit. Just push it. Oh, okay, you don't have it. I get it now. Engels says, since the historical appearance of the capitalist mode of production, the appropriation by society of all the means of production has often been dreamed of, more or less vaguely by individuals as well as by sects, as the ideal of the future. But it could become possible, could become a historical necessity, only when the actual conditions for its realization were there. Like every other social advance, it becomes practicable not by men understanding that the existence of classes is in contradiction to justice, equality, etc., not by the mere willingness to abolish classes, but by a virtue of certain new economic conditions. The separation of society into an exploiting and an exploited class, a ruling and an oppressed class, was the necessary consequences of the deficient and restricted development of production in former times. So long as the total social labor only yields a produce which but slightly exceeds that barely necessary for the existence of all, so long, therefore, as labor engages all or almost all the time of the great majority of the members of society, so long of necessity by this society is divided into classes. Side by side with the great majority, exclusively bond slaves to labor, arises a class freed from directly productive labor, which looks after the general affairs of society. The direction of labor, state business, law, science, art, etc. It is therefore the law of division of labor that lies at the basis of the division into classes. But this does not prevent this division into classes from being carried out by means of violence and robbery, trickery and fraud. It does not prevent the ruling class, once having the upper hand, from consolidating its power at the expense of the working class, from turning its social leadership into an intensified exploitation of the masses. But if, upon this showing, division into classes has a certain historical justification, it has this only for a given period, only under given social conditions. It was based upon the insufficiency of production. It will be swept away by the complete development of modern productive forces. I just got lost. He says, and in fact, the abolition of classes into society presupposes a degree of historical evolution at which the existence, not simply of this or that particular ruling class, but of any ruling class at all, and therefore the existence of class distinction itself, has become an obsolete anachronism. It presupposes, therefore, the development of production carried out to a degree at which appropriation of the means of production and of the products, and with this of political domination, of the monopoly of culture, and of intellectual leadership by a particular class of society, has become not only superfluous, but economically, politically, intellectually, a hindrance to development. Engels says to the bourgeoisie, "Move, bitch. Get out the way. You're in our way. Get lost forever." You guys, everything in reality is in a state of development. It is coming and going. It is being born. It is dying. Every class which exists will be born and will die. The bourgeois class will eventually die. With that, the antagonism with it. And with that, so will the proletarian class. Everything is in a state of development. Everything is coming and going. Everything is that has been born will die. It is metaphysical to deny this. It is childish. It's like looking at the animal kingdom and denying evolution. So it's about time some of y'all get with it. This is a scientific way of looking at the world. And I know it hurts some of you hearing that coming from me because I'm a dumb guy and I get this. How can a dumb guy get this but you don't? Engels says, this point is now reached. Their political and intellectual bankruptcy is scarcely any longer a secret to the bourgeoisie themselves. Their economic bankruptcy recurs regularly every 10 years, or 7 now. In every crisis, society is suffocated beneath the weight of its own productive forces and products, which it cannot use, and stands helpless face to face with the absurd contradiction that the producers have nothing to consume because consumers are wanting. The expansive force of the means of production bursts the bonds that the capitalist mode of production had imposed upon them. Their deliverance from these bonds is the one precondition for an unbroken, constantly accelerated development of the productive forces, and therewith for a practically unlimited increase of production itself. Nor is this all. The socialized appropriation of the means of production does away not only with the present artificial restrictions upon production, but also with the positive waste and devastation of productive forces and products that are at the present time the inevitable concomitants of production, and that reach their height in the crises. That was a hard sentence to get through for me. Further, it sets free for the community at large a mass of means of production and of products, by doing away with the senseless extravagance of the ruling classes of today and their political representatives. The possibility of securing for every member of society, by means of socialized production, an existence not only fully sufficient materially and becoming day by day more full, but an existence guaranteeing to all the free development and exercise of their physical and mental faculties. This possibility is now, for the first time, here. But it is here. I'm going to skip that reference. And I'm just again, thinking of China right now, how it's just thriving. How it's getting better every day over there. Whereas in the imperial court, it's getting worse every fucking day. Despite the fact that we allegedly have all the wealth in the world, right? Like, what the fuck is going on, man? It's clear they hate us. It's clear they just fucking despise us. Like, they treat us like we're animals, and by doing so, they've dehumanized themselves in the process. Like animals. I hope you forgive my turn of phrase there. I don't think we should treat animals like shit either. You get the idea. So he says, with the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously, the mastery of the product over the producer. Dan, hold up. That means you're saying that when socialists seize the means of production, they're just going to stop making things? Is that what you're saying, Dan? He's saying that the production of commodities will be done. We're going to stop making things, Dan? We're not going to make things anymore, Dan? No, dummy. We're just getting away with this whole thing where we're overproducing shit that we don't need. He says anarchy in social production is replaced by systematic, definite organization. Yeah, something. What is the fucking phrase? What's the Marx phrase? What is the phrase? You know what I'm saying? From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. Again, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. So, instead of a society that goes, commodities, 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 we go to, hey, if you need something, we're going to try to make sure you have it. Which one sounds better to you, you know? God. You tell me. Commodities, commodities, commodities. It's just all this is, man. Just look around. Commodities, commodities, commodities. It drives me nuts. Where am I? Fuck. I got lost. Got these cicadas buzzing behind me, too. All right, so I'm just going to read it again. With the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, simultaneously the mastery of the product over the producer, anarchy in social production replaced by systematic, definite organization. The struggle for individual existence disappears. Then, for the first time, man, in a certain sense, is finally marked off from the rest of the animal kingdom and emerges from mere animal conditions of existence into really human ones. You know what? It actually tracks that the fucking bourgeoisie treats us like animals. You know? Because they are animals. They've like not yet evolved from like animals. Wild. I know we're animals, but like we have consciousness that is definitely different from the rest of the animal kingdom. Come on. We have a consciousness that is qualitatively different from the rest of the animal kingdom. And the bourgeoisie acts like they don't. That's just blowing my mind right now, right? He says the whole sphere of the conditions of life which environ man and which have hitherto ruled man now comes under the dominion and control of man, who for the first time becomes the real conscious lord of nature because he has now become master of his own social organization. The laws of his own social action, hitherto standing face to face with man as laws of nature, foreign to and dominating him, will then be used with full understanding, and so mastered by him. Man's own social organization, hitherto confronting him as a necessity imposed by nature and history, now becomes the result of his own free action. The extraneous objective forces that have hitherto governed history pass under the control of man himself. Only from that time will man himself, more and more consciously, make his own history. Only from that time will the social causes set in movement by him have, in the main and in a constantly growing measure, the results intended by him. It is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. Let us briefly sum up our sketch of historical evolution. 1. Medieval society. Individual production on a small scale. Means of production adapted for individual use. Hence, primitive, ungainly, petty, dwarfed in action. He says petty here not in a moral judgment, but in a qualitative judgment. He's saying it's not big, not a lot, is what he means. He says production for immediate consumption, either of the producer himself or his feudal lord. Only where an excess of production over this consumption occurs is excess offered for sale, enters into exchange. Production of commodities, therefore, only in its infancy. But already it contains within itself, in embryo, anarchy in the production of society at large. It also contains that germ of capitalist society. 2. Step 2 of our sketch of historical evolution. 2. Capitalist revolution. Transformation of industry. At first, be means of simple cooperation and manufacture. Concentration of the means of production, hitherto scattered, into great workshops. As a consequence, their transformation from individual to social means of production. A transformation which does not, on the whole, affect the form of exchange. The old forms of appropriation remain in force. The capitalist appears. In his capacity as owner of the means of production, he also appropriates the products and turns them into commodities. Production has become a social act. Exchange and appropriation continue to be individual acts, the acts of individuals. The social product is appropriated by the individual capitalist. Fundamental contradiction, whence arise all the contradictions in our present-day society moves, and which modern industry brings to light. Then subset A. Subpoint A. Severance of the producer from the means of production. Condemnation of the worker to wage labor for life. Antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Subpoint B. Growing predominance and increasing effectiveness of the laws governing the production of commodities. Unbridled competition. Contradiction between socialized organization in the individual factory and social anarchy in the production as whole. Subpoint C. On the one hand, perfecting of machinery made by competition compulsory for each individual manufacturer and complemented by a constantly growing displacement of laborers. Industrial reserve army. On the other hand, unlimited extension of production, also compulsory under competition for every manufacturer. On both sides, unheard of development of productive forces. Excess of supply over demand. Overproduction and products, excess there of laborers without employment and without means of existence. But these two levers of production and of social well-being are unable to work together because the capitalist form of production prevents the productive forces from working and the products from circulating unless they are first turned into capital, which their very superabundance prevents. The contradiction has grown into an absurdity. The mode of production rises in rebellion against the form of exchange. Subpoint D. Partial recognition of the social character of the productive forces forced upon the capitalists themselves. Taking over of the great institutions for production and communication, first by joint stock companies, later by trusts, then by the state. The bourgeoisie demonstrated to be a superfluous class. All its social functions are now performed by salaried employees. And he stops there when talking about capitalist revolution after point D. If Lenin was writing this, he would write subpoint E, wouldn't he? And included in that would be what kind of analysis? Well, it would be a Leninist analysis, wouldn't it? Because he would be Lenin, and that's what he does. He would do what's called a Marxist-Leninist analysis. He would bring this analysis to what was his present time and include an analysis of imperialism, that which is now currently still our current epoch of capitalism. And then he says, 3, proletarian revolution. You know what? I just realized. Fuck me, man. My screen's been frozen there for a minute, hasn't it? Well, oh well. That's my fault. Point 3, proletarian revolution. Solution of the contradictions. The proletariat seizes the public power, and by means of this transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. This has happened in a number of places around the world. By this act, the proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital they have thus far borne, and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon a predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. The development of production makes the existence of different classes of society thenceforth an anachronism. In proportion as anarchy in social production vanishes, the political authority of the state dies out. Man at last the master of his own form of social organization, becomes at the same time the lord over nature, his own master, free. You cannot be free under capitalist society. It's not possible. He says to accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions, and thus the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish. This is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism. And I hope you've enjoyed reading Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels with me, Dan, on Read Aloud. If you like this content, and I hope that you do, please consider supporting. There's lots of different ways you could support. One of the best ways is to support on Patreon. Patreon.com/IDanSimpson. You can support for as little as $1 a month, and you'll get early access to some of my content. To some of my media. All right, replay live viewers, stick around. If you're watching the replay here, why don't you check out something else that we've read here on Read Aloud. Love your face.